Welcome to HBTV. I'm Harry Binswanger, the HB in HBTV. I'm a philosopher who advocates Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. Today we're going to discuss property rights. We're going to discuss it from an angle that it's never discussed. What are property rights? What is their validation? And what is their origin? So let's just hop to it. What are property rights? Well, what are rights? Ayn Rand defines rights in a way that cuts through many of the problems surrounding the concept of rights in the history of philosophy. The genius of her definition is that rights are moral principles. They're not possessions. They're not attributes of you. They're not conventions. They're not gifts from either Congress or a supernatural spirit. Rights are moral principles saying that something is right and something is wrong. What? We get to the differential. Moral principles defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. Defining meaning demarcating, saying their essence, saying what they are. And sanctioning meaning expressing approval. You know, sanction is one of three words in the English language that can mean exactly the same as their opposite. Sanction against Russia means negative judgment, negative withholding of values from them. It's a bad thing. It's kind of, in effect, punishment. But to sanction something also can mean the opposite, not to regard it as bad and punish it, but to regard it as good and give your consent and approval to it. And that's the sense of sanction, the good sense that this definition means. Moral principles saying this is what your rights are and they're good, defining sanctioning. A man's freedom of action. Both words are important. They're freedom and action. Now, this is rights in general, but we have to use this to get to property rights. What is freedom? Oh, freedom's a cloudy wonderland thing, right? Freedom, one man's freedom is another man's slavery. No, freedom is the absence of initiated physical force. Freedom is the ability to act without somebody stopping you by force. That's the meaning in objectivism to the term freedom. So it's a freedom of action, freedom to move and talk and do and buy and sell and live. Freedom of action. In the social context, that is a relatively sophisticated part. It doesn't merely mean that Robinson Crusoe doesn't have rights, that the concept does not apply to him, it would not be formed to handle him. It also means if you're out in the frontier before there's government and an organized society, you don't have the issue of rights arising. The issue of rights arises when you're organizing a government. You're setting up a government. For instance, in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their nature, I'm changing the words, with certain inalienable rights. Actually, it says unalienable in the Old English. That is the time that you need a theory of rights, when you're going to make the transition between interpersonal ethics, with the right and wrong of one person dealing with another person, and the law code of an organized society with the government. So rights do not arise as an issue in the state of nature, but they do arise when you enter civil society, as it's called, when you do organize society and have a government. So that's a relatively sophisticated aspect. I'm not going to be talking about that here. It comes up in other cases, the things to discuss. But the essential is rights say freedom to do the things that you have the rights for is good, is the fundamental social good. It's the good without which no other good can exist. So a right is not something that is minor or on the side in society. It's the precondition of any human relationships that are sustained, in society. They indicate they define and say this is what is needed about man's relationship to the state and man's relationship to other men insofar as there's an issue of freedom. It doesn't say, you have a right to something doesn't mean it would be good if you had it, or you have a right to an action doesn't merely say it would be good if you did it. It's saying that this is untransgressible. This is an absolute. This is of the essence of man's relationship to man and man's relationship to the state. So you can have a right to do something that's immoral. You can have a right to do something that's not right. For instance, to take drugs or to go to church, which are pretty much the same thing. You can have a right to be rude to somebody. It's not that you have a right for that. Your rights can extend to cover that. But the reason is that rights pertain to your freedom of action, and a wider issue than, say, rudeness or taking drugs is your basic freedom from the government and from other men. It's your ability to act as an independent being. Now, if you're going to be an independent being with freedom, that means nobody stops you when you make mistakes or evade and are immoral about the use of your freedom until the point at which it impinges upon someone else's freedom. The saying, my right to swing my fist ends at your nose. There's no such thing as morality approving of a right to deprive others of their rights. Rights are universal. Any man's freedom of action is an absolute requirement of civilized existence. That's why, you could look at it as rights and principles saying freedom is good. But that's so mild. It's not just good. It's the whole good that makes possible living with other people under government. Okay, so if that's what rights are, what are property rights? Property rights are the moral principles defining and sanctioning freedom of action regarding material values, the material values that one owns. Why? Well, let me quote what Ayn Rand says about that. The right to life, this is quoting from her article, Man's Rights, which everyone should read. The right to life is the source of all rights, and the right to property is their only implementation. Without property rights, no other rights are possible. Since man has to sustain his life by his own effort, the man who has no right to the product of his effort has no means to sustain his life. The man who produces while others dispose of his product is a slave. So you can see that the right to life, which is the fundamental and all-inclusive right, of which all others are specifications, requires that you be able to own what you produce to sustain your life. Now, suppose, for instance, the government says, well, you have an absolute right to life, but you don't have a right to any piece of food. If you start to put a piece of food in your mouth, we're going to take that food away from you. You have the right to your life, but you don't have the right to be on any piece of ground. So you're a criminal just by standing there in your home. It's not your home. We don't recognize property rights. It's society's property. And you don't have a right to be on it. We can take it away from you. And then you have to go to jail or be shot because you're a criminal at that point. You can see without the right to own or rent from an owner land, without the right to own food, you were a slave of the state. You're a criminal if there's no rights. If there weren't. And this is what the Soviets said to justify censorship. A Soviet apologist in Russia at the time said, listen, society, the government, the party, owns all the printing presses and all the paper, and we have to decide what we're going to do with it. So we think it would be a waste of paper to allow these dissidents to go into print. It's not that we're depriving them of the right of free speech. We're just saying they're not allowed to have any of society's paper to do that. They're not allowed to have any of society's lecture halls to do it. They're not allowed to have any of society's megaphones to blare in the public square their ideas. So that's a good example. And she was quite sincere, if you can call that sincerity. He was quite serious about it. Without property rights, no other rights are possible. So in order to have the right to life, which is the fundamental right, you have to have the right to produce, gain and keep, use, and dispose of material values. You're not a ghost. Why does property have to be private? Why can't one say, well, yes, there has to be property, but it's society's property, or it's the government's property, or it's the king's property? Because the root of ownership is production. And production is the result of individual thought and individual effort. There's nothing produced communally by some sort of communal mind. There are things that are produced cooperatively, but nothing is produced without an idea that originated in one mind. There is no collective brain, to quote the Fountainhead. Every person's thinking is his own thinking. And your thinking and your particular action is what brings material values into existence. Property should be private because the mind is private and the body is private. So that brings us to the subject that I am particularly fascinated with, that I want to devote the rest of this time to, which is, how do you come to own something? Well, there's two means. There's two means. Now, we're talking about not how do you come to possess something. We're talking about how do you come to have a right to it. How does it come to be something that belongs to you and no one is allowed to seize it from you? There's two ways: transfer and creation. So, transfer, what do I mean by that? Well, somebody else who owns it says, here, you can have this. And there are two ways they can do that. One is you pay them, you exchange your property or your service, your goods and services, for their product or their service, or as a gift, including charity as a gift. So either the person who has it and transfers ownership to you is doing it in order to gain himself. He wants a value that you have, your money, or if it's a swap, the thing you're swapping for. Or else he's just saying, here, take it. You don't have to pay me for it. The other way that, because that just begs the question, right? It just raises the question. Doesn't quite beg the question. Raises the question of, well, how come he owned it? The answer again could be, well, he got it from someone else who owned it and gave him title to it. Well, how did that person get it? Ultimately, you have to get back to the creation of a product. And the creation of a product means to produce it out of something. There's no creation ex nihilo. I can't, go like this and have an apple appear in my hands. Or an Apple computer, for that matter. So the production of some entity out of materials is of two kinds. From the materials that you own, or the materials that are not owned. If it's from owned materials, like you go to the store and you buy some flour and butter and eggs and baking powder, and you make bread. You own the butter and the flour, etc., because you bought it, and that goes back to the previous thing. But how did the supermarket get it? Well, they owned it. Not just how they get it, but how they get the right to it. They bought it from the miller and the dairy farmer, etc. Maybe through a couple of middlemen, but it's still, where did they get it from? Well, they grew the wheat, or the wheat that was grown was sold to them in the ground that they own, or they had a cow or cows that they owned. So you can see that it has to go back. How did they come to own that? It has to go back to the original, through a long, long chain of transfers, to the untransferred, original, unowned materials. Some frontiersmen went into land that was not owned by anybody and fenced it in and improved it. Somebody went out and picked berries off a bush that when the berries weren't owned by anybody and the land wasn't owned by anybody. So we get back to the stage before there was property rights and government, when people applied their knowledge to producing values from natural materials, unowned materials, unowned land. Well, didn't somebody own it? No. Does anybody own Mars? Suppose Elon Musk sends an agent to Mars, as I hope he will in the not too distant future. And that guy goes around Mars and fences part of it in or scoops up some fascinating rocks or whatever and brings it back, or fences it in and stays there. That is not owned yet, but he brings it into ownership, and that's the interesting thing. First of all, I want to say that it really is unowned, and the value is 100% created by the thinking and effort of the individual who interacts with it. If you fish out of the sea, they're not owned until you catch them and pull them up. Then they're yours. It's not that they were owned by society. What society? It's not that they're owned by God. John Locke, the great, terrific founder of the theory of individual rights, got this wrong. He said God gave the world to mankind in common. There is no God, and nobody gave anything to anybody. Nobody gave you Mars or planets circling Vega or Antares, which hopefully we'll get to someday. Nobody gave land to the North American continent to anyone before even the Indians came here. They're going back about 20,000 years. So it's really unowned. It's not given to anybody in common. And then if you hold that it is, you have to say, well, how does one person take part of God's gift to everyone for himself? And Locke got into a little difficulty over that. No, it's unowned, and you make it own. You make it yours. The other thing is closely connected that Locke got wrong. He said 99% of the value of materials is from the working up of them, which didn't exist before you mixed your labor with them. No, it's not 99%, it's 100%. Land, dirt, trees, berries do not exist qua values until somebody perceives them, recognizes their positive relationship to human life, to his life, and starts to use them. It's thought and effort that transform natural materials into property, into what you own. And the whole of capitalism, which is the unknown ideal, as Ayn Rand calls it in her book of that title, the whole of capitalism is symbolized by a man goes out into the unowned woods in 1750, goes into some part of Kentucky or Indiana, which is unoccupied. He cuts down some trees. He puts up a log cabin. Nobody else can come in and burn it down or kick him out and start occupying it for themselves. That's the whole of capitalism right there. What you produce is yours. The mere fact that someone wants it or people vote to take it away from you is not a moral justification. That's a violation of rights. And that points to how ownership originates. Ownership rights originate from use rights. There's two principles that explain the origin of a piece of property. How did this thing get to be owned? Ultimately, it goes back to unowned raw materials that somebody started using, making use of for himself, and no subsequent user may interfere with the first user. That's the moral principle that starts us on the road to property rights. If you're using something in nature, unowned nature, Nobody else can interfere with you in that use. So if you're fishing, we're in the 1750 in the wilderness, you're fishing in a stream. Somebody can't come in upstream of you and dump toxic chemicals, not that they had toxic chemicals then, but imagine. No one can, or dam up the creek so that you don't get fish anymore. If you're using it and his use interferes with yours, he's wrong. He's violating your right to use it. You don't yet own it, but he's violating your right to use it, and he's second. You were there first. You started using that creek. He can't interfere with that. Why? Because any other system would mean no one could survive and we'd all starve to death. If you had the principle, a later user gets to take or interfere with what the earlier user did, well, then a still later user could get in and interfere with him, and nothing could be achieved. Full property rights, title, enforceable by a government when one is established, comes from exclusive and permanent use. This is why the American Indians, those other than the Pueblo dwellers, but the nomadic tribes, did not own the land. You don't get property rights by merely camping out on it for a week or a month. You have to register that with other people and with the government that you are the permanent and exclusive user of it. And that means you have to use it for a certain period of time and then go file a claim with the land office. And there are plenty of things that you don't care to make your property. If you're a fur trapper in the Louisiana Territory in 1800, you want to own your traps, but use rights are fine. If somebody builds a cabin somewhere in the territory that you've been occupying for traveling around in to set your fur traps, you don't care as long as the beaver still come. It doesn't interfere with you. It's not true that every use you want to make permanent. You're going to move on in a month to another area. You don't need permanent and exclusive use of it. You go to the Grand Canyon, you look at it and say, wow. Before it's owned by anybody, I guess it's not owned by anybody, it's, quote, public property. But you go to the Grand Canyon, you look around and say, boy, I want to come back here someday. That's not, no one can interfere with you. No one can come up and put, his body between you and what you're looking at. You have use rights while you're using it, but you don't intend to permanently occupy that piece of land. It would be probably a terrible place to live on the edge of the Grand Canyon. So that's the origin of ownership rights in previously unowned materials. First, you get the right to use them. The first user has the right to use it. No one can interfere. After you make your use of it permanent, which is some period of time and some like fencing it in and demarcating, and then registering it with the government so that your use intentions are objective and people are put on notice. This is his place. He owns this. He is not moving on. At that point, you have a right to the land. That's your property. The government would merely register that fact and give you a title. A legitimate function of government, registering deeds and titles. Okay, that's all for this session of Meeting of the Minds. Let me see, Dylan, there are probably questions in the chat or no?
Yeah, we have quite a few questions.
Well, why don't we do those next time?
Yeah.
That'll be the subject of next Monday.
Sure.
Because there's a lot of interesting questions and some that I can raise myself. Okay. Until next time, thanks for attending. See you next Monday.